Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. We try to stay on top of things that, are really affecting people out there. And today we're looking into President Trump's recent executive orders that are targeting DEI initiatives.
Yeah.
This is something a lot of people are trying to get their heads around. And we found this CBS News article that we're going to be looking at today. It's titled, "Trump Doesn't Only Want to End DEI, He's Also Voiding a Civil Rights Era Anti-Discrimination Rule."
Wow.
So we're really going to dig into what's going on here, look at some different perspectives, and what it all might mean for you.
Well, I think you've definitely picked a hot topic. It seems like every time you turn around these days, there's some sort of debate about diversity and inclusion, especially in the workplace,
Yeah.
and how that all connects with, ideas about fairness and merit when it comes to things like hiring and promotions. Right. Right. And it's a lot to untangle. I mean, this article really zeroes in on Trump's executive order from January 21st, particularly this part where it revokes a rule all the way back from 1965. That rule was set up to protect workers against discrimination from federal contractors.
Right.
Can you kind of give us a little bit of background on that? Like, what exactly was this rule all about?
Sure. So this 1965 Equal Employment Opportunity Rule,
Okay.
this was a really big deal at the time. It essentially stated that if a company wanted to do business with the federal government, they couldn't discriminate against workers based on factors like race, gender, or religion.
Wow.
And when you think about it, with 3.7 million people working for federal contractors today,
Oh, yeah.
this rule had a massive impact.
Yeah, huge impact. And of course, getting rid of something like that is going to cause some waves.
Absolutely.
And the article highlights Fatima Goss-Graves, who leads the National Women's Law Center.
Right.
And she's calling this a direct attack on the whole concept of non-discrimination in the workplace. Yeah, I mean, she makes a good point, right? When you think about it, for decades,
Right.
this rule has been a foundation for fair treatment, at least when it comes to hiring, for a huge part of the workforce.
Yeah.
And removing it, it's like you're taking away this essential safety net.
Right.
And that's why so many people are seeing this as, well, a step in the wrong direction when it comes to workplace equality.
Yeah, that makes sense. The article even points out that this goes beyond just DEI programs.
Yeah.
So could you break down that distinction for us? Like, what's the difference?
Definitely. So DEI initiatives, right, they're usually about actively creating environments in the workplace that are inclusive.
Right.
Whereas, this rule we're talking about, this revoked rule,
Yeah.
this was about legal protection against discrimination, which, had real consequences.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, while we still have basic anti-discrimination laws on the books, taking away this specific protection, it definitely weakens that safety net,
Right.
particularly for folks working for companies that have contracts with the federal government.
So it's less about saying, hey, let's get more diverse representation and more about just making sure that the basic rules of fairness when it comes to hiring and employment practices are actually being followed.
Exactly.
And the article even quotes Josh Boxerman from the National Employment Law Project.
Right.
And he's concerned that people might be less likely to come forward if they experience discrimination
Yeah, that makes sense.
because there's less legal backing now.
Right.
It also makes it a lot harder for the Department of Labor to look into those sorts of claims.
Makes sense.
So I guess that kind of naturally leads to this question of like, well, what about private companies?
Yeah.
The article suggests this might be just the tip of the iceberg.
Right. And there's this legal expert, Alex Hontos, who thinks that this whole thing might be a stepwise approach,
wow.
So basically, first they target federal contractors, and then eventually the administration might set its sights on private companies who are really engaged in DEI work.
And, it's interesting because even without this kind of direct pressure from the administration, we're already seeing some companies scale back their DEI efforts.
That's true. I think the Supreme Court's 2023 decision on affirmative action in college admissions has had a real ripple effect.
I bet it.
And then you've got pressure from conservative groups as well. And it's creating this sense of caution, maybe even fear around DEI in the private sector.
So with all of this going on, what exactly is the administration's rationale behind all of this?
Well, they say it's all about restoring what they call a merit-based system for hiring and promotion.
Okay.
And if you look at the actual wording of the executive order, it claims that DEI programs have actually led to, quote, illegal, pernicious discrimination based on things like someone's race or gender, instead of focusing on their actual capabilities.
So essentially what they're saying is that these DEI initiatives, that they're actually working against the idea of hiring the most qualified person for the job.
That's the main argument, yeah. And it gets to the heart of a really big debate that's happening right now. What does a truly merit-based system look like? Like, can you actually have a system that's totally neutral and objective?
Right.
Or is it always going to be influenced by things like unconscious bias and all these societal factors we have to consider?
That's a really tough question.
It is.
And the article mentioned that there are already lawsuits piling up against DEI
Oh,
programs,
I bet.
with some people claiming reverse discrimination and even free speech violations.
It's definitely a really sensitive issue. On the one hand, you have folks who feel like these DEI programs has gone way too far,
Right.
that they're creating more discrimination, not less.
Wow.
But then on the other hand, you've got people who strongly believe that these programs are absolutely necessary to address those historical inequalities and to really try to create a level playing field for everyone.
It feels like people are really digging their heels in on both sides of this issue.
They are.
And the article even highlights that there are a lot of diverse viewpoints even within the DEI movement itself.
That's true.
It quotes Eric Smith from the Cato Institute, and he seems to be making a distinction between different kinds of DEI.
Yeah, he's saying that Trump is actually targeting what he calls the critical social justice version of DEI, which Smith sees as really divisive.
Okay.
And that's an important point because it suggests that not all DEI initiatives are the same.
Interesting.
Some are really focused on just getting more diverse representation,
Right.
while others are more about tackling those systemic power imbalances and challenging the existing social structures, which can get pretty controversial.
So it's almost like we have this really complex situation with legal challenges, philosophical debates,
Right.
and even different understandings of what DEI is supposed to be all about.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And then on top of all of that, the Trump administration steps in and takes some pretty swift action.
It was like right out of the gate. They started putting federal employees in DEI roles on leave.
Oh.
They made all these online DEI resources disappear, canceled training sessions, and even started terminating contracts related to DEI work.
It's wild. And then to top it all off, the executive order says that federal agencies have to identify potential civil compliance investigations into private companies. This sounds like they're looking for DEI programs that they can basically label as discriminatory.
Yeah, exactly. And Josh Boxerman, the guy we were talking about earlier, he's calling this whole thing a name and shame tactic. He thinks it's designed to just scare private companies off from even thinking about DEI.
Wow.
It creates this chilling effect where companies are going to be so afraid of getting targeted by the government that they might not even want to talk about diversity and inclusion at all.
This is really intense. It feels like a turning point in the whole conversation about diversity and inclusion.
It really does, doesn't it? This whole situation is bringing up a real clash of values and ideologies. You've got people who are convinced that DEI programs have gone way too far and are actually undermining fairness and merit. But then you've got others who are just as strongly convinced that these programs are absolutely essential to fix the systemic inequalities that we're dealing with.
And it seems like both sides are really entrenched in their positions.
Absolutely. But, it's important to remember that this isn't like a black and white issue, right? Even within those broader groups, there are so many nuances and different perspectives. Like, you can totally support the general goals of diversity and inclusion, but still have concerns about how certain DEI programs are being implemented. And on the flip side, you can criticize DEI without being against diversity itself.
So how do we even move forward when everyone seems to be so divided?
That's the big question, isn't it? And honestly, it's probably too soon to say what the long-term consequences of all this will be. But I think we can start by thinking about the potential outcomes, both the good and the bad.
Okay, so let's start with the potential downsides. What are you most concerned about?
I'm worried that all of this could lead to a big rollback of diversity and inclusion efforts. And I don't just mean in government, I mean in the private sector as well. And if that happens, we could see a less diverse workforce overall, particularly in leadership positions. And it could mean that all the progress that we've made in recent years towards making workplaces more equitable just starts to unravel.
It would be a major step backwards. Are there any potential upsides here? Like, could this whole shakeup actually lead to any positive changes?
It's definitely possible. Sometimes when something disrupts the status quo, it forces everyone to rethink their assumptions and maybe come up with some new solutions. Maybe this pushback against DEI will spark a renewed focus on different, maybe more creative approaches to promoting diversity and inclusion.
So instead of completely getting rid of DEI, maybe we'll see some new strategies that address the concerns of those who feel like things have gone too far, while still trying to make workplaces more just and equitable.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe this whole situation will force a deeper conversation about what merit really means. Is it truly objective? Or is it shaped by all these biases and societal factors that we need to be more aware of?
That's a good point. This deep dive has been incredibly insightful. We've gone from talking about the specifics of this executive order
Hmm.
to exploring the whole history, the legal framework,
Hmm.
and even the philosophy behind DEI. It's clear that this is a really complicated issue without any easy answers.
Yeah, and it's a story that's still developing. It's going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out, not just in the courts, but, like in real workplaces across the country.
I agree. It'll be really interesting to see what happens. And I think that's exactly why it's so important for everyone to stay informed.
Right.
I really encourage you to keep looking into this issue. Read things from different sources, talk to people who have different opinions.
Yeah.
It's a chance to really understand just how complicated all of this is, and then you can kind of come to your own conclusions. Yeah, that makes sense. It's easy to get caught up in all of the strong opinions and all the noise out there.
Yeah.
So what advice would you give to our listeners on how to approach this whole thing, in a way that's thoughtful and informed?
I think the most important thing is to approach it with curiosity instead of judgment.
Okay.
Don't go in thinking you already know everything. Ask questions, listen to different sides, and be open to changing your mind. It's a chance to learn and grow, even if it gets a little uncomfortable sometimes.
That's great advice.
Hmm.
And you know what they say? Knowledge is power. The more you know, the better equipped you are to deal with these complicated issues and actually fight for the kind of world you want to live in.
Exactly. And this isn't just some theoretical debate happening in a courtroom somewhere. This stuff affects real people. It affects their lives, their jobs, and how they feel like they belong in the workplace.
Yeah, that's a good point. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's like the one big takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
Hmm. That's a good question. I think the most important thing is to remember that this isn't just about politics or lawsuits. It's about people. It's about creating workplaces where everyone feels valued, respected, and has a fair shot at success. And honestly, that's a goal worth fighting for, no matter how tough it gets.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We've covered so much ground today. We talked about the specifics of Trump's executive order, but then we got into all these bigger questions about diversity, inclusion, and what it really means to build a fair and equitable society.
It's been a really interesting conversation, and it all comes back to you, the listener. What role do you want to play in all of this? How will you use your voice and your actions to make the world a more inclusive place? These are big questions, but they're definitely worth thinking about.
They are. This whole deep dive has just reminded me that even though we don't have all the answers, we have to stay engaged, stay informed, and be open to hearing different points of view.
That's the key.
Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive. And until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep asking those tough questions.